Hey, when we think about composition and we think about writing or communication, because of course, composition takes multiple forms beyond just the linguistic text. But when we think about communication, we think about rhetoric and the rhetorical situation. But if we don't understand what those things are, then we can't take them into consideration with our writing. So, what is rhetoric and what is the rhetorical situation? And when do I use it? Why does it even matter? Plato once said that rhetoric is the art of ruling the minds of men. Now, I would be hard pressed to admit that I want to control anyone's mind. That's not going to happen. I really don't. What I want to help you do is to understand how to think for yourself and how to know when someone else is trying to pull the wool over your eyes or someone else is trying to rule your mind. Rhetoric, then, according to Aristotle, is that art of discovering the possible means of persuasion in reference to any subject, the function of no other of the arts which is able to instruct and persuade in its own special subjects. Thus, medicine deals with health and sickness and geometry, but rhetoric is the ability to discover the means of persuasion in reference to any other given subject. Meaning this, that when we use rhetoric correctly, carefully, wisely, we're able to communicate and to persuade and to get our point across effectively. Whether that point is just to simply be heard, or whether that point is to persuade someone else to see things our way. That's rhetoric. The Purdue Owl defines rhetoric and the rhetorical situation as this: any set of circumstances that involves at least one person using some sort of communication to modify or change the perspective of at least one other person. Simply put, it's an awareness of the language choices we make and why we make them. This semester, we're focusing on the rhetorical situation and rhetoric as it applies to all our writing types, whether that writing is visual or textual, also known as linguistic, whether it's spatial, or whether it is gestural. We're thinking about how we are communicating to at least one other person and what we hope to gain by communicating to that person. The 5 elements of the rhetorical situation are as follows. We have a message. What is the author saying about a subject or a topic? It's important to know what they're saying so that we can then analyze how they are saying it. The author is also important, and while we might know the author's name, when we say who is writing or speaking, it goes beyond their name. It goes beyond what they are talking about, and it goes into their background. We're going to get into a little bit more of this as the semester goes on, but we need to know exactly who is that person behind the microphone or behind the pen or behind the keyboard. What background experiences are they bringing with them? What mindsets are they bringing? What values or judgment systems? This all plays a key role into understanding the author. As important as it is to understand what the author is talking about and who that author is, we also need to know who the intended audience is. It is so often that I hear students say, oh, the audience is whoever was going to pick up the newspaper. Actually, it's not. It's not just whoever picks up the newspaper or whoever walks down the grocery store shelf, but the audience is someone intentional. That writer is speaking to an individual or to a group of individuals. And when we think about who they're speaking to, we have to understand what is that group's background. What is that group's value system or moral code? What are their own experiences? And why is it so important that they hear or see or view the text? That gets us to our purpose. Because just like we need to know what the author is saying and who the author is and who they're speaking to, we need to know why they were saying their message. What is it that they really wanted to happen because of what they're saying? That is the purpose. What are they hoping to do or achieve? And then we need to know the context or the exigence. This is the why the author discussed something on this topic or issue. What's the situation that led that writing, that speech, or that advertisement to even taking place in the first hand? All of these things are the rhetorical situation. And here is where we will circulate all of our learning throughout the course of the semester. If you're visual, like me, then maybe this would help you envision what I'm saying about the rhetorical situation. Everything is connected and everything is within its own bubble. We have an author, we have an audience, we have a purpose. And inside of all that is that message. But then affecting how that purpose and author and audience interact is the context and that exigence. So let's pause for a second and think about context and exigence. I said before that that context is what's going on at that timing. And then the exigence is the why now. Why is it so important to get the message out? And here's the best example that I've ever heard, and I can't claim to be the brain that thought of it. But let's think about Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. His purpose is to enact change. Yes? His purpose is to help create equality. His purpose is to help stifle the violent acts of protest that were going on because, of course, Dr. King was for peaceful protests. So we know Dr. King as the author, and we know he's a theologian, and we know that he studied Gandhi's writings, and we know he studied other non-violent protesters. And we know that he was um, a great advocate for equality. But we think about his audience, and if we really dove deeply into his speech, then we would know he had multiple audiences. First of all, he had the African Americans who were fighting alongside of him for their own equality, and they were tired. And so he says, don't grow weary in this fight, and by all means, don't become violent. So that's one audience. But at the beginning of the speech, he's speaking to the American government, and he says, you've written us a bad check, and you know what? We've come today to cash that check, and you're actually going to do what we want. That's the second one. And then he has a different audience for the white Americans who are fighting alongside of him. And he says, we thank you. Please keep up this fight with us. And so he had three different unique audiences, and he taps into their unique belief systems, their unique value systems, and he does that in a set way. But here's where context and exigence come in. The context is the civil rights movement. That's what was going on in that time period. That's what's going on in the 1960s when he gave the I Have a Dream speech. But the exigence, why now? And that was simply the March on Washington. That is what gave him the platform to be able to speak to the hundreds of thousands of viewers, whether they were watching on TV or whether they were there in Washington, D.C., or listening over the radio. That was the exigence. Had it not been for the March on Washington, Dr. King's speech would not have reached the hundreds of thousands of listeners that he did reach. So the context was the civil rights movement. That's what prompted him to want to fight for equality. But the exigence, what allowed him to give the speech in that moment, was the March on Washington. So we have purpose, an author, an audience, exigence, and context, all for the message of we deserve to be treated equally, right? So that is, in a nutshell, the rhetorical situation. But let's keep going. When we think about that author, and here I've moved author to the top, the pinnacle of the triangle, we think about that credibility of the author, that credibility of the speaker. That speaker cannot reach the audience until they have proven themselves credible. When they speak with that authority, that tone, that style, that diction. So let's once again jump to Dr. King. Dr. King uses we and our and us. And so he's speaking with that credibility that people in the audience who are either physically there or listening or watching remotely can connect with him. He also speaks of a shared faith, right? And so he mentions scripture and he brings in history. And so he brings in those shared experiences. And that is what taps into his own credibility that the people can understand and connect with. But your audience has emotions. And most of the time, when we're really thinking about this rhetorical situation for an argument's sake or for persuasion, we know that whoever we're speaking to, we want something from them, even if it's just for them to hear us and understand our perspective. But what's blocking them from really hearing us is their emotion, their personal connection or emotional impact. And so we use pathos, that emotional connection. This is what I said one time to a different class, that an emotional person cannot think logically until you've changed their emotion to think passionately about what you think. It works in a circle, right? So you have to understand, where are they coming from? What are their backgrounds and experiences so that they can understand your emotion and begin to share that emotion with you. And that leads us to your purpose. Your purpose is for them to think logically about what you're saying. And they all work together, because they can't think logically if they don't trust you. And they can't trust you if they don't begin to emotionally feel what you feel and then to think logically about what you think. So you, the speaker, have to demonstrate your credibility. And you do that through your diction, your style, your shared value systems. And you get your audience to think emotionally, and you tap into their pathos. And then they can think logically about what you're saying and understand your purpose so that your message could be heard more clearly. All of this is really combined so that your message and what you're saying makes sense to your intended audience. The way you frame it is what's going to connect with that intended audience, because it's not just any old Joe who's listening, it's who exactly you want to hear. Once again, that speaker is forming that ethos, that credibility of communication. And it's established through this awareness, your status, your professionalism, whether it's a celebrity endorsement. And this helps the audience trust that you know what you're talking about. Pathos is that audience, that emotion, and you really want them to feel excited for you or angry for you or motivated to change whatever is going on so that your message and your purpose are then conveyed. So what's going on right now? Whatever is causing that need for the writing, and what is that catalyst? That is that context and exigence, that time and that time period, that geographic location, the current events, the cultural significance. If we don't stop and think about these, then we don't fully understand why the speaker is speaking in the tone in which they're speaking, or why they're speaking to that intended audience, and even what they hope to gain because of it. All right. It's more than just an assignment for your composition class. Every day you encounter rhetoric. Every day you either use it or you receive it. And if we don't understand rhetoric, then we aren't as great of consumers as we are. Or maybe we don't vote the way we could vote because we're not really understanding rhetoric. Maybe we're not even as successful in our job fields. And so this applies to you because every day you use communication. Email responses to customers, to consumers, to professors, email responses to colleagues or bosses. Some of you might be going into a career field where you have to write business proposals, or advertising or marketing, customer service, forms or grant proposals, and the list goes on and on and on. Every day when we encounter the general public, at some way, we're using that rhetorical situation. And in some way, maybe whoever is speaking to us is just wanting us to hear emotionally what they're saying. But is their message communicated clearly? And how can we use the rhetorical situation to understand what they are saying? We're going to pick up here where we left off in the next video.